episode of Real Estate Real Talk with me, your host, Jolson Torquato. Our real talk for today, or real talker for today, is Mohamed Gardee, a property risk consultant with vast experience in student accommodation. Mohamed, how are you, sir?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for having me, Jolson.
It is an honor. It is an honor. Mohammed, we like to start off by getting to know our interviewee. So, would you tell us who is Mohamed Gardee?
Okay, so Mohamed Gardee is someone who's worked in investment banking, he's worked in property, he's worked in all different roles along his life. I've been most active in the property market. I think I started property probably 25 years ago or something like that. And it's just been a great learning experience all along.
So it
So I
became your...
currently work as a consultant. I'm a property risk and valuation consultant. That's my current role.
Okay. So you ventured out from the strictly financial market and you went more into the property sector.
Yes, that's right. I'm specialized in that right now.
Okay, so how has that trajectory been?
So it's a difficult trajectory to make. The difficulty was in deciding exactly what you want to do. You know, you go to university, you study all the different things and learn all kinds of things along the way. Choosing what's the right thing for yourself, that's the difficulty. Once I understood that property was something that I was good at and I understand it very well, it was very easy to then make a success of it.
Okay. And so the whole premises of you being here is your speciality in student accommodation. Would you mind telling us how you got started in student accommodation? What made you make that jump into student accommodation? And what did you start with in the beginning before going to student accommodation?
Okay, so student accommodation isn't a new thing. It seems to be new because of the media reports on it and people have only caught on to it now. But the way I got into student accommodation is the way I got into different markets over time. You need to be constantly looking at the landscape and seeing what's going on out there. You need to understand what's going on in the market. You need to be on the cutting edge to be able to know what the need of the consumer is. So it was very easy to understand in 2012, 2013 that education was becoming a very important factor in South Africa with a lot of young people. And it became obvious that most people going to universities will then need accommodation. You have to just do an analysis of where young people come from, and anyone who comes from outside of the province is going to have to settle somewhere when they come to the big city to study. So it became very easy to see that was something that was going to do well. There was a demand for it. I started doing some analysis and looking at different universities. And then I came about finding NSFAS and how their model works. So it took a lot of research to understand it. I started with one small commune in Brixton. I bought a house and, just to try it out to see if it works. And it's just grown from there. And as you know, this market has become one of the biggest markets and most resilient in COVID.
That is very, very interesting. With the large influx of people that are currently focusing on student accommodation, because when people realize that this is the market to be in, there was a huge influx of people going towards that market. Do you find that it's a bit more difficult now to invest in student accommodation or to secure funding for a student accommodation development? What is your perspective? What is your view on that?
So that's correct. There's been a lot of new entrants into the market, but the underlying factors driving the market still are the same. They still exist and they're still very strong at the moment. So the key thing you need to do is you need to understand that underlying market like you would in any other investment. So student accommodation specifically, if you understand the dynamics at play and you understand that in most cities and most universities, there's still a vast undersupply of beds for student accommodation, you'll find that there still is a demand. So the fact that a lot of new entrants have come in means that some of the prices have driven up. But if you understand what you're providing and you look at the end user, it still becomes quite a profitable and easy thing to do.
So when you say that the prices have been driven up, why would that be so? Because if there's new entrants into the market, wouldn't that push the price down and tighten your margins?
No, so at the moment, what's happening is a lot of people have tried to get into student accommodation without doing much analysis, without looking at all the different factors you need to look at it: zoning, land use, all the accreditation stuff. There's a vast range of things you have to look at, and without looking at that, they've just started buying properties and hoping to do good.
Okay.
So that's driven the prices of assets up. But it doesn't mean it's expensive. I'm saying traditionally these assets were very low priced.
Okay.
They're now a little higher priced. But I don't think everyone's done the analysis correctly, and some people are going to burn their fingers.
Okay, so in terms of entrance and difficulties into entrance into this market, what would you say is the biggest hurdle that a new potential developer would face if you want to invest in student accommodation?
Okay, so we get asked this question quite often, and I think the easier way to answer this question is to say, who is the right person to do student accommodation? What kind of person should invest in this asset class? So I find a young person starting out in his property career is the right kind of person for this. You need a lot of energy. You need to understand how this market works. You make more or higher yields on smaller assets than you do on bigger assets. So, the fallacy of if you go big, you'll make far more money. In this asset class, it's not the case. If you bought a small house and you converted it, all the guys are adding rooms and doing that kind of thing, and you run it yourself, it's a very good way, one, to learn property in a place that's still got a lot of demand and that's still doing quite well. So I would say the person who wants to do this should be actively managing the business, actively running the thing, and who's able to do that.
Okay, and when you look, and now if you look at it from a corporate point of view, so you see large companies like South Point, who focus a lot on mass redevelopment of previously office buildings into residential accommodation. How are they in this market? How are they seeing their market share affected, if they are at all?
So if you look at the bigger players, the reason they're getting into student accommodation purely because student accommodation is the best asset class at this time. It's also as a result that in the last 2 or 3 years, other asset classes have performed poorly. So with the money that the big corporates have, they need to find yield somewhere. So they've had to put their money in certain places. And being a resilient asset class was the way to go. So they would be willing to accept a lower yield than a potential individual investor, only because they look at very big deals. And in the scheme of big deals, student accommodation is still doing a little bit better than offices or retail or other asset classes.
Okay. That's a very good point. You mentioned one of the biggest problems that is faced by new entrants is the fact that they don't do enough analysis. In terms of legality and compliance in the business of running a student accommodation, what do they have to look at?
Right. So the most important thing, remember, people are doing this from residential property. So the assumption is that you can just share a house with somebody else and start charging them rental, which is not the case. You need to understand how zoning works. You need to understand the difference between rezoning and a consent use application, when each one will apply, what is allowed on a property, what's not allowed on the property. So that's the analysis you need. So it's not complicated analysis, but you need to understand that you need a town planner, you need advice on that. You shouldn't just buy something based on a low price and believe that everything else is in place. You need to do some due diligence. So an easy example is, this is not like buying a buy-to-let. You're not buying a 2-bedroom apartment somewhere where you can easily rent it out and there's nothing to do. This is a little more complicated than that.
Okay. Now that makes sense. And these bylaws and legal matters, they're readily available for people to look at, but they're just not making use of the information. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So it's not complicated at all. You could download, if you Google the land use policy for Joburg, for example, you could download the commune policy for Johannesburg. Those two documents alone will tell you everything you need to know. You could go on to, depending which university you want to provide students to, you could go to, say, UJ's website, and they would tell you what the accreditation policy is. So it seems that a lot of people have not been doing that due diligence. They've been buying properties and then trying to fit it afterwards. I think the common mistake people make is they've been buying properties that are very close to the university. They've been pricing it based on that instead of the other way around.
Okay, and that's just one of the factors that have to be considered. Okay,
yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
And so in terms of resistance and resilience, so the property, it seems as if with COVID, the student accommodation market isn't doing too well. Is that true, or what is your view from the ground? Because with students being sent back home, universities closing, what does that do to your bottom line?
Right. So it's actually the other way around. So I do teach a course on student accommodation, and I'll share the details with you at some point. But the bottom line in that is the model you want to be on is you want to be on the NSFAS model, which is the way that student accommodation should be done. Then you would have done far better than any other asset class. And the reason being, students have been sent home, but there's no one in the property, so your rates, taxes are still there. Your lights and water cost has gone to zero because there's no one in the property. And NSFAS is still honoring their lease obligation. So they're paying for the space that's empty. So you've still got a tenant who's paying you, and your op costs, have gone down. So it's quite a good lease to have. Whether someone's in it or not, you've got the government behind the lease. Obviously, that comes with some complications, as does with any business with government. But in a time when everybody else doesn't have money, you're assured that you're getting your rental. So it's done actually quite well through COVID. I think the concern that some of the people had, which is not really a concern, is about whether online learning will become the norm and whether there'll be a place for student accommodation. But I don't think that will change anything. Going to university is a rite of passage, and many young people embark on their journey early in life, and they move away from home. It's part of the experience of moving away from home. So there'll always be a demand for student accommodation. You'll just have to match what the market wants at the time.
Okay, that's I wasn't expecting that answer. I was expecting to hear a very negative answer on the performance of the market, but it goes down to showing that your research is essential for the success of your investment.
Yes. If you were in the cash market, if you were charging cash to students, then you would have definitely suffered, because the first expense that would be cut if a student had to move home, their parents are not going to pay for them not to be at your accommodation. So it's exactly like you say, if your research is done correctly and you've managed all those risks in your due diligence, you would be fine.
Okay, no, that's great. In terms of you're investing in student accommodation now, the kids want new hip places. How do you accommodate that for the students? What do you do for the students? Because
so that's a very good point you make there. That comes down to the economic theories of consumer preference. So not to get too technical on it, but if you're on the NSFAS model, the rate that you charge per student is the same no matter what your accommodation looks like. If you're accredited, then the rate is the same whether you're a big provider or a small provider.
Okay.
So exactly to your point, you need to give extra amenities to remain competitive, because you're not competing on a price basis. So you need to understand the market. I think the most important thing that people want is high-speed Wi-Fi. They need a place to, be able to relax as well. They need common rooms where they can interact with each other. So it can't just be the old hostel model that, a university res looks like. Okay. You need to understand what the younger market wants.
Okay, so you go around, you look, and you see what they're offering, and you try and beat that. That's what you do.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Very interesting. If you were to give advice on managing risk to anyone that's currently in student accommodation, what would that be?
Okay, so if I had to give one piece of advice in the current environment, I would say don't be fooled by a low interest rate and take on debt because you believe debt is cheap at this point in time. The financing decision and the investment decision are two separate decisions and should be treated as such. If your investment analysis and due diligence make sense, then you can add a little bit of debt to your profile to be able to leverage off that. But a lot of people are taking this low interest rate environment as a chance to get into assets without looking at what the assets are actually worth. Remember, your debt is going to be for a long period of time. Interest rate's going to stay low for a relatively short period of time. So I would say that's the biggest concern I would have right now.
Okay, that's a very good point. Very good point, because the number of people that have said, "Oh no, I'm going to do this now because interest rates are low," are astronomical, actually.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then do you have an idea of how the student accommodation market is performing in other parts of Africa? I know that there's the university environment in Africa is developing. It is a developing sector or area. Do you have an indication of other tangible markets to look at?
Yeah, I think there's been some studies done on Tanzania, and that's also quite a good market. I don't think any of the other African countries have the same model as we have, where you've got a government organization funding the accommodation costs. So in the rest of Africa, you're still on the traditional old student accommodation model, where you rely on the parents and the student themselves to fund that accommodation. So that becomes a little bit risky, in that you've got credit risk based on the tenant profile. And typically a young student is not someone who has a good credit scoring because they don't have any income earning at that point. So you're reliant on their parents. So there is more of a risk element. But at the same time, you'll need to understand what the accommodation systems are in those countries. And there definitely is a need for accommodation.
Okay, Mr. Gardee, thank you very much for your time. Could you share your contact details so that people can get in touch with you should they need any advice on student accommodation?
Yeah, sure. You can share my email address with anyone who needs to contact me. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, and keep up.
Thank you very much, Shilson.